Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Policy Committee, held as a hybrid meeting this evening, and we do have some guests joining us from Thames Valley Police, so we'll make the most of the magic box as we go through the evening. Just remind people, as usual, to put your microphones on when you're speaking, turn them off when you're not, so that everybody is able to hear us online. And the meeting, of course, is webcast and recorded for posterity. Now, the monitoring officer has a couple of announcements, I believe.
Thank you, Leader. Just to advise the committee of two changes to membership, in that Councillor Mary O'Connell has taken the place of Councillor Ricky Devine, and that Councillor David Stevens is no longer sitting as a member of the Policy Committee.
Thank you very much. Plenty of time to gloat on the latter, but just to pay a tribute to Councillor Devine and understand, of course, the reasons that he stood down as a Lib Dem group leader and stood down from this committee. But I think he's a very dedicated public servant, and I'm sure we will continue to enjoy his engagement in the full council meeting and in other committees. And I'm sure everybody across will pay tribute to him as well and wish him all the best for the future. Wonderful. Right. So if we move on to declarations of interest, are there any? No. Brilliant. On to the minutes of the previous meeting, pages 5 to 16. Any comments on these? Am I okay to sign them as an accurate record? Wonderful. Thank you very much. Petitions and questions, we have received none, which is very unusual, but it does make for a swifter item. So on to item 5, decision books. None have been called in. So we can move on then to our Thames Valley Police presentation. So we have with us tonight the Police and Crime Commissioner for the Thames Valley, the Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police, and the Local Policing Area Commander. Gentlemen, I don't know what order you were intending to present in, but if I hand over to you and perhaps you could introduce yourselves fully as you come to speak.
Certainly, thank you very much indeed. Nice to be joining you work remotely. If you're all happy, I'll proceed first with my presentation, and the Chief will follow with his, and then very happy to take questions on both.
Wonderful. Over to you.
Becky's fantastically showing the slides. If we can have the next slide, please. All right, so the first bit I'm going to cover off this evening is a quick canter through my police and criminal justice plan. This is the statutory document which I, as a police and crime commissioner, have to produce, which sets the high-level priorities for the force, and it's effectively the key document that I hold the Chief Constable to account for delivering. And then I'll proceed to a few more local areas of interest that may be a benefit to members. So if we can move on to the next slide, the first of those 5 priorities is strong local policing. Now, this covers a wide range of areas, and for some members who'll be familiar with the document, the bullet points cover some of the specific areas of work within the plan. Clearly, recruiting more police officers, we'll come on to touch a bit more on that later in the presentation. That's clearly a big piece of work for the force as part of that national uplift of 20,000 officers, and I'm seeking to go beyond that with further recruitment beyond the Home Office funded work. Supporting neighbourhood policing, I think this is vitally important, especially in a large and growing town such as Reading. There are many areas of business for policing, much of which goes on behind the scenes in many ways and doesn't get seen by the general public, who want some visible neighbourhood policing and dealing with the sort of neighbourhood crimes of burglary, vehicle crime, some of those issues which perhaps otherwise they consider may go without proper regard. So definitely a shift to try and get into the world of prevention and to deal with some of those local issues, while still preserving the ability within the force to deal with the larger strategic threats and those high harm crimes. So particularly around here, looking at public safety, what we can do to keep people feeling safe in our communities, particularly, of course, in the current context, thinking about women feeling safe, particularly in the nighttime economy. And there's obviously a lot of work that's been going on within the force around Project Vigilance that works into an awful lot of that. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Fighting serious organised crime. Now, the big headline here is obviously county lines, which I think we're all a lot more familiar with than we would have been a few years ago. We are sadly very familiar with this awful business model, which does deal so much in exploitation of the young and the vulnerable in society as part of that trade. Now, nationally, we've had some success against county lines gangs, and that's been reflected locally within Thames Valley. Some really good work, and definitely a need, which so far we've been reasonably successful at trying to hold that ground, so that when county lines drug gangs are disrupted, they're not able to come back as quickly as they would want, and we're hopefully able to prevent other gangs, whether they be local or county lines gangs, from filling that space. A lot of that work is carried out through the Violence Reduction Unit, of which I'll talk about a little bit more later. There's absolutely a drive to look at reducing deaths by knife crime, and of course we've seen some horrific incidents in and around Reading as a result of that. So that's really a core body of the Violence Reduction Unit work, but there is a significant piece of work around serious organised acquisitive crime as well, and recognising that organised crime takes many shapes, and it's not just some of those headline grabbing areas. So particularly around acquisitive crime, looking at early intervention that we can do to prevent some of that. Move on to the next slide, please. So fraud and cybercrime, and this really goes much wider into equipping the force to deal much better with all types of modern crimes. Just about every crime these days will have some sort of digital footprint. Even the sort of traditional non-cyber crimes, the burglaries, the assaults, will have some form of digital footprint, which results in more analysis being required and much more technology to support that. So we're looking at a significant boost to forensics, both what might be called wet forensics, but also digital forensics, to make sure the force is best equipped to deal with that going forward. But also getting to that space of fraud and cyber more specifically. Some of that is work that it needs to be done nationally, and I'm working with colleagues to look at how we can enhance things like action of fraud, which has a particularly poor reputation at the moment. It's not within the gift of TVP, but we need to work collaboratively to improve the service to the public. Thames Valley, as the lead force for the South East Regional Organised Crime Unit, also has a role to play in making sure that our investigations into all types of economic crime, fraud and cybercrime are improved. And we've recently put some of those Thames Valley resources into the regional unit to try and bolster the capability, which is having some good impacts. As I say, there's some sort of traditional types of fraud that we need to cover in this as well, which aren't always cyber enabled, and my office are in talks with the trading standards teams across Thames Valley, looking if we can pull together a network so that we can use trading standards as a way of preventing fraud across all of our communities, because a lot of that will be happening across local authority boundaries, and there's definitely some benefit to be had from combinations across those areas. We can move on to the next slide, please. So the fourth of these 5 areas is around improving the criminal justice system. Again, those bullet points there. A lot of focus here on how we deal with domestic abuse, rape and sexual assaults. We're well aware of many of the delays in the courts, partly as a result of COVID, but frankly, anybody who was involved with criminal justice previously knows there were significant delays prior to COVID. And they're particularly difficult around some of the complex cases of domestic abuse and rape and sexual assault. So there are some pilot schemes in place in Thames Valley, looking at how we can get those cases through to the courts quicker, and some conversations ongoing with the Crown Prosecution Service to try and reduce some of the bureaucracy between the organisations to make sure that we can get those cases to court as quickly as possible. That's not just important because those cases deserve to be heard quickly, but we all know that the longer it takes to get cases to court, the more likely victims are to disengage with the process, and we need to make sure that we can deliver justice for victims as swiftly as possible. There's a whole range of other areas of work we need to do in this area, particularly around reducing reoffending in Thames Valley. We know that a lot of crime is caused by a small cohort of people. The majority of people released from prison in Thames Valley will reoffend within 12 months, and that's something we need to change. So there's some work which I've commissioned recently looking at the whole system approach, which is now working with youth offending teams. Probation will have a report to be published shortly on that, and we have a bid into the Ministry of Justice for some specific funding around changing some of the systems that will allow us to get much more support around people leaving prison, not just simply to improve their chances of turning their lives around, which is important in its own right, but obviously anything we can do to reduce reoffending will prevent more people from becoming victims of crime in the future. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. And the final one of these is tackling illegal encampments. Now, it's obviously very specific compared with some of the others, but there's there for a very good reason, because this is a controversial area, and often both sides of the argument can feel that it's used as a political pawn. And if it's not highlighted as a priority, it's an area that frankly gets neglected, and I don't think that serves anyone. So where there is a controversial issue like this, I prefer to face them head on. There is significant work that's already gone, that's already been underway between local authorities and the police to make sure we have better systems in place to deal with illegal encampments when they do incur. And Reading certainly gets a significant number in any given year to make sure that the responsibilities between the police and local authorities are well understood, and people can act accordingly. But of course, there's new legislation going through Parliament at the moment, which would significantly shift the balance of power, and so the police need to be prepared for that change if indeed it does come about. Move on to the next slide, please. And at the back of my document of the Police and Criminal Justice Plan, there's an appendix listing a number of areas where we're looking to develop more specific strategies. This is just a small sample, there's more than 20 in there. The first ones that we're looking to work up, consult on and publish will be 3 around domestic abuse, around public space safety for women across Thames Valley, and how we deal with rape and serious sexual assault. And then there's some of these others which will be coming forward soon after that, hopefully particularly on road safety and rural crime and business crime. Can we move on, please? Right, so community safety partnerships. I'm sure there'll be some discussion of this evening. I've introduced a new formula for the Community Safety Fund across Thames Valley, which guarantees funding for the next 3 years. Previously, funding was allocated on an annual basis. This gives not just certainty for the future, because the funding was never guaranteed from year to year, but also the ability to spread the spend across those 3 years. So if councils through the community safety partnerships want to develop a project that perhaps has a particularly high spend in year 2, they can carry money over or bring money forward from a future year if that's appropriate. The funding formula is based on population, on crime, non-crime data. So I'm sure that'll have some conversation about that later on. We've increased the analytical support that's available through my office. We've got a full-time analyst. They're obviously doing primarily work for me in my office, but that facility is available to local authorities through community safety partnerships. If there are specific pieces of work that need to be done, then we're looking to support wherever we can. And obviously a big piece of work around joint bids and commissioning. Most appropriately locally is of course the Safer Streets Fund, which I think Reading was in receipt of around £400,000 as part of that bid, which I've managed to prioritise, and we were successful at the Home Office, and will continue to support bids from local authorities. And of course we work very closely with your community safety manager to make sure the delivery of that is appropriately supported by us and the force. And there's a real shift now to get those community safety partnerships to look at prevention and antisocial behaviour specifically. Clearly, that's often been their core work, but sometimes the focus of CSPs has strayed into other areas, and frankly, CSPs are best positioned to deal with some of those prevention areas. And we're also talking to local authorities about how we can perhaps collaborate on community trigger applications and come up with some single process for Thames Valley, but that remains to be a point of discussion, and hopefully we can be moving some things forward on CCTV in the near future as well. Move on to the next slide, please. So fly tipping, these are just a few specific projects I wanted to highlight. This is a pilot I'm looking to launch in Oxfordshire with one of the district councils, but if successful, would seek to roll out across the whole of Thames Valley. There's a particular challenge around fly tipping on private land, which is often left uninvestigated and victims unsupported. Sometimes the role of all local authorities is simply to fine the landowner rather than assist, because of course your current contracts don't cover the removal of waste from private land, and you don't want to incur that cost. So the model, which has worked elsewhere in Northamptonshire, and we're looking to mirror down here, would be that I would provide funding to you as a local authority to clear the waste on private land, on the proviso that you then use your investigative powers to investigate those fly tips, and if fines can be levied, then those can be brought back into a recycling fund, so that in the future then the removal of waste from private land can be funded. Hopefully this will increase the number of people brought to justice for fly tipping and reduce the number of incidents on private land that go uninvestigated, and hopefully drive down the total number in all. As I say, it'll be a pilot scheme which will hopefully get up and running later this year, and if successful will roll out elsewhere. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Community Speedwatch. So this is a pilot that was run early last year throughout to October, where we supported groups of volunteers across Thames Valley who took part in Community Speedwatch. We're providing them with equipment and training, a new back office system. It's not a new scheme as such, but we've relaunched it with a new structure to it, and that seems to have been well received by those volunteers who've taken part. We've now gone back out to all of the existing groups across Thames Valley who had been dormant previously, and got them onto the new system, and from spring of this year we'll be looking to promote to secure new groups. The key thing about this versus where we were previously is there's an escalation process, so that whereas in the past some volunteers felt that they were perhaps getting involved with Community Speedwatch, but it didn't really result in anything other than perhaps a warning letter to an individual. Now obviously we still have those letters that go out, but it also builds up the data, so we're able to escalate through local neighbourhood policing teams to do some Speedwatch activity, and if that's not successful, to deploy roads policing, and ultimately then to come back to you as a local authority, although this won't work in every instance, but to come back and identify where there are speeding problems, and perhaps it's an issue of road layouts or some other control measures that could be put into place. And obviously in the longer term, with regard to speeding, we're looking at things like average speed cameras, which I know Reading have always been very interested in, and very keen to make sure that we use the experience of others. So Hampshire, that our roads policing unit are shared with, are currently doing a trial down in their force, so we'll look to learn the lessons of that to learn for Thames Valley. We can move on to the next slide, please. Police officer numbers, I mentioned clearly at the start. We've seen a significant increase already. In June of last year, we were at the highest point of officers we'd ever had in Thames Valley by full-time equivalent, by headcount as opposed to full-time equivalent. By the end of the uplift, we should have just over 600 officers, and I have an ambition to increase that recruitment beyond the 2023 Home Office target by making sure that our numbers can at least grow in line with our population growth, so that we don't ever sink back again by reaching a new high and then resting on our laurels. So we're modelling that through the budget to hopefully be able to fund that locally. We're also funding an increase in the recruitment of PCSOs because we've been below establishment of those. There's some challenges about getting the recruitment through training at Selmstead, because simply a matter of capacity, because we're recruiting so many police officers at the moment, but we've got funding in place to make sure we can get more PCSOs. And I'm also keen to focus on how we can get more specials and other volunteers into policing. Special constables particularly, we need a significant increase to try and get up to our numbers, where ideally we'd be at around 10% of our establishment. And we're looking at some of the ways in which we can support our volunteers to make sure that they are feeling valued within the organisation, and they will give those hours freely to us. Special constables, I think, are fantastic, not just because they give their time freely, but because they bring some amazing skills from outside of policing, which can be hugely valuable. If we move on to the next slide, please. Victims First. So this is the overarching brand, if you like, for my services that support victims of crime. They provide free emotional and practical support for victims of any crime, and anybody can be referred into Victims First. You're a victim of any crime in Thames Valley. We get them through various routes. Police officers will ask if victims would like support from Victims First, but anybody can come through, and we work with a number of charities who will refer people to us. We have a dedicated team based down at Calcott. They act as a one-stop shop, if you like, where people can phone in. We then refer on to specialist services if appropriate. We're currently in the midst of reviewing that whole process. It's been in place for a couple of years, and so we're just taking a look and making sure that that is fit for purpose. But we have a really good dedicated team down there who do some fantastic things to support victims. Moving on to the next slide, please. The Violence Reduction Unit I mentioned earlier. So this is a cross-agency project, staffed mostly by Thames Valley police officers, but it truly is a collaborative piece of work with local authorities represented, along with health and other partners. There are several areas. There's probably three main areas of work. One is the operational response, so increased stop and search, increase hotspot patrolling to make sure that we take knives off the streets, tackle drug crime, and reduce that fear of crime on the streets now. There's a much longer term piece of work which is particularly involving local authorities' health education around how we try and prevent knife crime, particularly in the future. And some of that is working with children and young people to deter them from getting involved with gangs. Some of it is working with families to tackle some of those endemic problems which we know can cross generations. And the final area of work, which I think is really exciting, is Thames Valley Together, which is the data project that brings together data from the police, from the NHS, from local authorities, not in some sort of aggregated anonymous way, but in actually linking individuals, so we can see an individual and look at what plans people have got in place across those different agencies. So that's live data that we're trying to bring together. It's a really exciting data project. There's obviously plenty of challenges along the way, but we seem to be overcoming most of those, and I think this will be one of the most advanced data projects in the country when we can get it fully populated. The next slide, please. Which I think you'll be pleased to know is my final slide before I hand over to the Chief Constable. So this is the Community Fund, which were previously known as the Police Property Act Fund, but nobody knew what the Police Property Act Fund of 1898 referred to, so we've renamed it. There's £100,000 a pot available twice a year, so that's £200,000 per annum. This is money that is taken from the sale of goods that can't be returned to their rightful owners, stolen goods that we've seized from criminals. So it's very much like taking money literally off the bad guys and giving it to good causes. Anybody can apply for grants to this scheme. There'll be another round of funding going out hopefully later this month. We had one earlier, at the back end of last year. The main criteria is that projects have to support the priorities within my police and criminal justice plan, but they are pretty widely based. So they're open to a wide range of organisations. The only limiting factor is, of course, we only have £100,000, which sounds like an awful lot of money, but just about every time we go out, we get around £800,000, £900,000 worth of bids into the fund. So we inevitably end up disappointing a number of people. But the only requirement on us is this has to be used for charitable causes. It doesn't have to be registered charities, but it has to be something that we can define as being charitable. So this is a really good opportunity to support groups within the community who help to keep everybody safe. That's the end of my presentation. So very happy to hand over to the Chief Constable and take questions after that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good evening, everybody. John Campbell here at Police Headquarters. Pity can't be with you in person, but thank you for the invite. I'm joined by Superintendent Steve Rafield, that some of you will have met. Steve is your new local police commander, and I'm very pleased that Steve was posted into Reading very recently, and for me and for Steve, that gives some consistency to who your local police commander is going to be for the next couple of 3 years, and that's because I do share and understand some of the frustrations with senior commanders moving around. The nature of the teams at Reading they are amongst my best teams, and sometimes they develop skills that seek them moving on and up the ladder, which is great for policing, but I appreciate the concerns and frustrations of losing staff and local arrangements. Thank you. Well, I think the first slide, hopefully you can see, is a picture of various operations that we've had since COVID, if you like, left, if you like, the main aspect of society before we've hit this second Omicron variant. And quite a busy year operationally for Thames Valley Police, above and beyond some of the issues that Reading has had, which we'll touch on in due course. But we had the pleasure of policing the funeral of Prince Philip, obviously the presidential visit of President Biden, We have been dealing with a large operational commitment. It's lessened a little bit lately over HS2, and that's generally Buckinghamshire and a little bit of Oxfordshire, but we have a large footprint of HS2. And then you'll see some wonderful pictures from Reading Festival, which was 140,000 young people enjoying themselves as they should do on the back of a pretty torrid 18 months or so when that festival went ahead. Thankfully, that went off pretty well, all things considered, and thanks for the work of you and others in terms of making that successful event alongside the policing aspect of things. And also, obviously, we welcome the Police and Crime Commissioner, newly elected in May. Thank you. Next slide. This slide it's a warehouse really, but it's a warehouse that's a very important warehouse, if that's the right expression. This is our PPE supply, and I mention this because TVP during COVID were responsible as a lead force for securing all the PPE for UK policing and also all our overseas territories as well. We still have relationships with a number of our overseas territories, and that involved us distributing 300 million bits of PPE across the UK and also internationally. I'm proud of that, quite simply, because in effect it allowed policing to keep going, because without PPE, as you know, things would have been very, very different for our officers engaging with the public and protecting them and the public. Thank you. Next slide, please. COVID-19, well, this is a little bit historic now because there's certainly less enforcement that we're doing, and also as a force we're getting relatively few calls around COVID. You'll see the peaks and troughs, both in terms of calls and also fixed penalty notices, and that just reflects the different types of rules and regulations. Now, there's no doubt about it, those rules and regulations were sometimes quite difficult to interpret and then share with the public to make sure they understood it. But the approach was, and always will be, you know, that engagement with the public and then only enforcing as a last resort. And you'll see a nod to around about 3,000 tickets that we've issued over the last almost 2 years now. And a pretty even spread across the whole of the force area, largely for gatherings, and I'll say no more. Okay. Steve will talk a little bit about the some of the local crime figures. So we're welcoming a significant reduction in burglary. We are comparing ourselves now to an average over the last few years, because to compare ourselves with the COVID year, in particular 2021, would be odd. But some welcome reductions for burglary. Definitely a touch of that will be working practices with people working from home, less opportunity for sure. So that's a welcome reduction. We have seen a really welcome reduction across the force area in knife crime and serious violence. You'll see there, that's down. We know that certainly last year, a terrible time for the communities and the people that were the subject to the violence at the start of last year, and a recent, obviously, conviction that you'll have been aware of over the last couple of days or so. And also a reduction in robbery, which is again a crime of violence, and then also a number of interventions around county drug lines and organised crime groups that each LPA will be involved with, Reading no less. Operation Sceptre, to the right hand side of that slide, is the National Knife Prevention Week that we engage with. That involves us doing knife sweeps, sometimes with partner agencies such as yourselves, but also high profile and education programs within schools about the dangers of carrying knives, and that was successful. And as I say, County Drug Lines Intensification Week is where we focus our activity in disrupting that type of crime. Next slide, please. At the top right hand side, you'll see some hopefully welcome news about the increase in positive outcomes compared to 2018 and 19, and that is detections in old money. We've had a real focus on improving the amount of detections that we get, seeking justice for victims. It's not anywhere near as high as I would want it to be, but it's a welcome increase and actually compares favourably with some of the national figures that we have from other forces as well. What I would say is that just point or draw your eye to Good Sam Instant.help, which is an app that we now have available in our force control room. And in essence, what it means is if a member of the public fears they're in danger or they want further assistance from us, we can in our force control room send a link to a member of the public who can then share with us the view that their camera has on their mobile phone. And that's a great development, because it means that if someone's feeling particularly vulnerable, we can obviously help them sooner with what they can see and what we can see, and also it helps with operation officers responding and their situational awareness as well. So there's been some good successes around that, And in the middle is our new digital investigation teams. It won't come as any surprise that some of the nature of investigations has changed. There's a much stronger digital footprint. Even the kinds of offences that many of us would have investigated younger in service, in terms of fraud or harassment, have now an online digital footprint. And this is a team that links in with all the local policing areas to provide tactical advice in respect to this quite detailed and technical area. In truth, I can only see that team expanding over time, but at the moment there's a team of officers at headquarters that help out Steve's teams locally. Next slide, please. Protecting the vulnerable, and in respect of this, obviously violence against women and girls is a key focus for us. It has always been a focus for us in terms of the types of crimes that we prioritise. So, for example, rape and sexual assault have always been a priority for us. Domestic abuse, where the predominant number of victims are women. But we are coalescing that into a broader strategy using the title of violence against women and girls, so that people understand the type of areas that we're looking at. Project Vigilance is an operation that's now being rolled out nationally, and this is where we use officers in the nighttime economy to identify predatory behaviour, predominantly by males towards women. And I think the very positive aspects of this operation are they focus on the predatory and, if you like, perpetrator behaviour rather than that of the women within the nighttime economy. And they've identified a number of people of interest. Arrests have been made, and also we're able to then provide support and safeguard a potential victim or a woman that's just going about their absolutely lawful and reasonable business in a nighttime economy. So that is something that was recognised by government. It's been rolled out nationally. We are also reviewing how we best investigate rape and serious sexual offences. You can have two models in my experience. You either have centralised teams that can be quite tricky if you have a large geographic area, or you are investigating crimes locally with your local CID. There's fors and against both methodology. What we're doing is reviewing the methodology that we have at the moment, which is the local methodology, and seeing whether or not we would benefit from more of a centralised team supporting local officers, but then building up that expertise. So that's a bit of work that we're reporting on, or be reporting back to me in due course. And obviously we'll share that with yourselves via Steve. On the right hand side, you'll see that we have had quite an increase, and a welcome increase, in the amount of arrests and detections for stalking. I mean, big numbers there that I think should generally concern us all. So, you know, the arrests for stalking have gone up in a rolling 12 months from 522 to 747. So that's that amount of instances where women in particular, it's not always women, but predominantly women, have their lives damaged through stalking and harassment behaviour. And I'm very pleased to see an increase in that, and long may that continue. Moving on then to 101. 101 itself is an area that in the past, I'm talking about within the last 2 or 3 years, certainly was a challenge for us. We've definitely improved, and you'll see that the average time is about 1 minute 56 seconds for 101. That probably isn't what is often reported back to me, but those are what the figures say, certainly on for the year. We did have, as we were hit by various sicknesses, as other people were, a tricky autumn, but I've been looking at the figures certainly for January, and the average time, wait time for 101 is around about 40 seconds or so at the moment, with obviously some very strong performance always with the 999 system. Certainly I get fed back, and you may do from your constituents, different levels of confidence in 101. You can certainly report online a number of offences and antisocial behaviour. Some people want to speak to an individual, I understand that, but we've made progress. It's something that will be a priority for me, and certainly I know for the PCC, and I report into him in respect of this performance area on a regular basis. So as I say, more difficult the last quarter of last year, but as I say, January appears to be much better for us and the public at the moment. Next slide, please. The Commissioner mentioned about the increase in the numbers of police officers that are coming into Thames Valley Police. That's on top of regular recruitment anyway, and a very welcome increase of around about 580 odd officers or so. We have taken advantage of the uplift and building on other work to look at increasing the diversity in this bulk recruitment of staff, and that has been quite successful. More work to be done, but at the moment, on a rolling 12 months, 49% of our recruits are women into the force, and 14% are from ethnic minorities. and a range of different ethnic minorities across the community. Now that's welcome at this time. It doesn't offset, if you like, some of the challenges that we've had over recent times with recruitment, but certainly a welcome step in the right direction. And then, importantly, obviously, when people from diverse backgrounds join the police, we've got various programs to make sure they're able to have influence and work through and get reward and recognition in the police service, and that helps us with our retention practice and policies as well. So that's quite encouraging. I would say Steve's going to talk a little bit more about assaults, but I would say that we are still seeing a high number of assaults. I'd argue that any assault is too high on police officers. You'll see that around about 1,300 officers over the last 12 months or so have been assaulted. That's of a fairly small number. So in TVP, I have around about 4,500 police officers across the 2.5 million or so residents in the Thames Valley. But most of those assaults will be taking place against the response teams that we have around and about. And so that's quite a number of officers that might have been assaulted more than once. So, and I've said before, I think in these forums, we acknowledge in policing that the nature of our role is that on occasion we'll be putting ourselves in harm's way, and quite rightly so. We have the training, equipment, and you know, the role to do that, but as a collective we shouldn't accept it, certainly in terms of any court outcomes. And I'm pleased to say in the great majority of occasions the court are very supportive. A number of those assaults more recently, over the last 18 months or 12 months in particular, have been where people have used COVID as an attempt to assault officers, either coughing and spitting. Thank you. Next slide, please. This is just a slide. I'll leave this one with you because I think you've got access to our slides. This is just the various entry programs coming into policing. The challenge for any chief constable and a commissioner is to try and get a diverse and representative workforce that has the diversity in all that brings in terms of heritage, background, thoughts. And so we have a varied programs of work and recruitment. You can come in without a degree and get trained to a degree standard. That's a 3-year program. You can come in with a degree and you do a 2-year program. You can come in directly without a degree at the moment, and that gives us hopefully a rich workforce to police the communities of the Thames Valley. Thanks. Next slide, please. And just a final thing about making use of digital developments. You'll see that during COVID, if there's one, and I'm sure it's the same with the local authority, you know, it can bring a catalyst for change. And certainly we were able to deploy a number of laptops and mobile phones across the organisation as we try to mobilise the workforce, both police officers and police staff, and that's very welcome. Those laptops and mobile phones are out in the community, out within the workforce itself, and we're making use of additional digitalisation such as Pronto, which is an app that allows officers and staff to maintain and complete some of their work-based updates actually remotely, in a way that probably had to come back to the police station more recently, and that appears to be rolling out well. Thanks. I'll hand over now to Steve to give you a flavour of issues within Reading. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, sir. And just a little introduction. So Steve Raffield, as already introduced, new LPA commander. Very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for letting me speak to you tonight. So my first slide centres primarily around some of those things which I think we'll be making more of an effort on this year. We talk sometimes in policing now more so about main effort rather than priorities, but certainly some of the areas that I'll be focusing on are around county lines, as we've already spoken about. Interestingly, we use county lines as a term, but of course my experience is that many of the drugs lines that cause harm are in fact local. And I think there's a piece of work here for us to do to understand those lines which are causing the most harm to our communities. That is something which is really important to me. And linking closely with child exploitation, significant publicity recently around the links to the use of drugs lines, organised crime groups and their exploitation of children. That for me is something which causes significant harm. And I think we need to better understand the process we go through in policing around applying a score to those lines which perhaps cause us the most difficulty in our communities. Having a top 5 in terms of those drugs lines which we think are the riskiest, for me, is something which is really important. Knife crime, for obvious reasons. I've probably not had the start I hope to have as the police commander in Reading. You'll be all aware of a number of fairly high-profile investigations, all of which, I have to say, investigatively have turned out really well. We've got cases charged really quickly, so our major crime units are very good at responding to some of our homicides. But certainly in terms of knife crime in general, we know the harm they're causing to our communities, and that for me needs to be a real focus, especially when it involves children. Domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, the Chief Constables and the Police and Crime Committee have already touched on the importance of violence against women and girls, around the importance of just understanding where those spaces are within our communities that cause our residents and visitors the most concern. And certainly some of the work we've done under Project Vigilant has helped us understand better some of those predatory offenders that might be preying on women in some of those areas. And domestic abuse is the hidden aspect of that. Most of you will be aware of the prevalence of domestic abuse. And we are far better at understanding some of the drivers of domestic abuse and some of our investigative response that goes into that. And I know there's a lot of work that goes on around support from other agencies and charities around making sure we get domestic abuse right and understand what that response looks like. I've put also here community tension and hate crime. For me, this is probably more about legitimacy of policing. And transparency of policing and understanding, helping the public to understand how we police and why we police a certain way. That for me is another area of focus, again against the backdrop of some fairly highly publicised incidents that have directly impacted on the confidence of our communities in policing. The CSP for me is a significant area of work. Somewhere for me that will facilitate some of this. It's somewhere I'll be putting quite a bit of effort into, and making sure that within this work I'm talking about here, these priorities, it aligns with the work that the CSP is doing. You'll all hopefully be aware of the new serious violence duty. We've started work as a CSP on that. And certainly working quite closely alongside the Violence Reduction Unit to understand what our duty might look like, and making sure that we really make every effort we can to drive down serious violence in Reading and knife crime as well. You probably won't be aware of some of the processes, and I think it's worth me mentioning that some of the level of scrutiny that goes into some of the crime we look at. So with all this work that I talk here about, some of our priority offences. Within our daily management meeting, I look at in significant detail some of the offences we have committed in say the past 24 hours. So we will talk about, and I will have oversight of, rapes, of domestic abuse, knife crime and assault police offences. And that should go some way to give you some comfort that actually these crime types have a high level of scrutiny. And the same for our tasking process. We have a tasking process which looks back at the last 2 weeks and then decides what our priority is going to be for the following 2 weeks. And that allows me to line up some of the things that have happened and some of what's going on the local policing area with some of these priorities that I talk about here. And I want that to be a truly partnership meeting. It's not currently, and that again for me will be an area of focus as I move forward. Talking about community scrutiny and transparency, we are starting to put together our community scrutiny panels, which will be the way of allowing the public access to seeing how we police and why we police in a certain way. Specifically, one of the areas, I guess, that normally gathers a high level of interest is around stop search, a very emotive subject, and allowing people in our community to look at body worn video which will show them how police officers conduct stop search will add to our transparency around how and why we do things in a certain way. If I could have the next slide, please. So, as I said already, Reading's certainly since I arrived, and certainly over the period of last year, there's always been plenty going on. I've talked a little bit about some of the tragedies we've had here, but also the investigative response that's been put in behind that has been excellent. And we've had some complications. You know, policing has at times, as I'm sure you'll be aware of in some of the other work we've been doing, is policing's been tricky through the pandemic. But actually we've managed to maintain a good level of performance throughout that. And the partnership has worked really hard to make sure that we keep delivering on some of those good results. And I've touched on some of them here. I won't cover them all. But knife crime obviously continues to be high up here. The community knife bins, some of the work we've been doing with Reading Borough Council around making sure those community knife bins are in place. I've talked about Project Vigilance. We did an event at the university a while ago to publicise some of the work around Project Vigilance, which went down extremely well. And we're working with Brighter Futures around child exploitation. And for me, it's really key that we identify cohorts of children who we're really concerned about, be either that they're at risk of exploitation, or they're at risk of knife crime, or risk of carrying knives, making sure that we truly understand where our risk lies as a policing area. And we've already touched on some of the work at Reading Festival, which was slightly different this year in how we went about tackling some of the underlying issues around crime, which we know go on as part of Reading Festival. And the Bravery Awards, a good news story. We received, or the officers received, that were involved in that, received some national recognition for the response to Forbury Gardens. And I went to the event in Reading, where I was allowed to share some of that experience with those officers that were involved in that. And I'm going to finish on, unsurprisingly, the major incident response to the fire at Roe Court. Very tragic set of circumstances, still ongoing and still taking up a huge amount of our time as a partnership. And some of you on this call will know some of the work that's gone into that. Still continues to have a significant impact, perhaps not across Reading more widely, but certainly to that community that are having to kind of suffer some of that disruption which is taking place like Roe Court. Next slide, please. And these are our some of our crime statistics, which I'm going to touch on. So in terms of crime reduction, the Chief Constable has talked about Thames Valley as a whole. Within Reading, a 45% reduction in residential burglary and a 30% reduction in personal robbery. Something which I think we should be really proud of. It's not just policing; it's the partnership as a whole. This is continue to drive down, and you would make a connection between perhaps a COVID year and some of those reductions and some of the reasons underlying that. But actually, our policing response to this and our ability to target certain people who are causing the most harm has undoubtedly had an impact here. And so that's something I think we should collectively be very proud of. Again, the 28% reduction in serious violence, which is something we've touched on already. Again, significant in terms of the connection with knife crime. And we need to be careful we don't always look at the headlines around knife crime, but actually look at some of the things we've achieved around serious violence and knife crime. 28% reduction, and also a 28% reduction in knife-enabled offences, which is again very significant. Some of the areas of concern, Again, we've touched on this already, but assaults on police officers, something which is very close to my heart. We have seen an increase here. I mean, there is a difference between an officer who gets seriously assaulted, and we are generally very good at our investigative response around those serious assaults. Something that I'm going to be focusing on is perhaps those areas which are lower level police assaults. If there is such a thing where officers are being kicked at or spat at, which have a significant impact on that officer, but perhaps aren't as serious as what the public would consider to be a more serious assault on an officer. And again, an increase in violence with injury, not including domestic abuse, is again an area that we need to focus on. The good news here is our ability to investigate those offences still continues to be really strong. A 38% increase year on year in terms of the number of old money detections we get for those offences. And then in terms of general outcomes, again, in Reading, something I'm again very proud of is a 17% increase in the overall number of offences we are detecting, which is again something which is very strong in terms of our performance. And then just lastly, 78% knife crime possession. So of all those offences where we catch someone in possession of a knife, we are taking formal action in 78% of those, which is something which we should again be very proud of in terms of that performance. So that's the end of my slides. I'm going to hand back to Mr. Campbell now.
Thanks, Chair. Mindful of time. So Becca, can you just go to the mutual aid slide and then I'll draw it to a conclusion. Thanks. And this slide just is a nod. On occasion, I have to draw some resources away from Steve to police some of those events that I shared at the start. Sometimes Reading will be a net benefiter of that. For example, we have officers from around the force supporting the inquiry into the fire, but we also on occasion have to support the national effort. So Thames Valley Police sent over 200 officers to COP26 to make sure that was a safe event, and also a number of officers to G7. But I'll conclude it there, Chair, and obviously happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, all three of you, and thank you to Rebecca, who I think is a real hero of the evening for remaining hot on the slides. I just wanted to quickly take a moment to thank Superintendent Raffield for his work since he arrived in Reading, which has been a very difficult and challenging period, of course, and he's really hit the ground running, but to thank him especially for his collaborative approach to working with the council, which we all greatly appreciate, both on a political level, and I know that officer colleagues do as well, and we look forward to having you around for quite some time to come. Now, I know that colleagues will have questions. I think what I'll do is I'll say that everybody can have an absolute maximum of 2 questions, and that's a maximum. You don't have to use them both. Don't feel obliged to do so. And I will go around those who indicate as they catch my eye. So if I start with Councillor Barnett-Ward.
Thank you, Chair, and I won't repeat, but I would like to echo your thoughts, your thanks to Superintendent Raffield, and of course thank you to all of you for the presentation. I do have 2 questions. I'll take them one at a time, but before I move to my first question, I do want to correct something in the Police and Crime Commissioner's presentation. He's correct that we do not have a budget for clearing fly tipping on private land in Reading. It's something we would very much welcome, and I'm sure our residents would welcome as well, not just us as a council. But we do, in fact, investigate and enforce against fly tipping on private land in Reading. So I was a bit disturbed to see it presented as it was, and it feels a little bit cookie cutter, something that maybe has been developed for somewhere else. We have a recycling enforcement team who do a lot of work with private work. We do take that to legal enforcement where appropriate. So that's not quite the picture as it was presented in the presentation. But I will move to my first question. And I think fellow members of the committee will have noticed some significant differences between Superintendent Raffield's policing priorities for Reading and the Police and Crime Commissioner's strategic priorities for the whole of Thames Valley, and that what is important to Reading is not necessarily reflected in the priorities that the Police and Crime Commissioner has chosen. And a significant difference there is tackling violence against women and girls. And the first meeting of the Thames Valley Police and Crime Panel, which I sit on as Reading's representative after the PCC's election, the panel made a point of this to the PCC, a disappointment that that wasn't there as a strategic priority, and made it clear at the time that his police and crime plan was being endorsed despite the fact that the priorities did not reflect the priorities that the panel wanted, and that it didn't have violence against women and girls on there as a strategic priority. At the last meeting that we had, I was very pleased to have the unanimous support of the Police and Crime Panel in asking the Police and Crime Commissioner to add a 6th priority of violence against women and girls to his plan. As we've just seen from the presentation, that sadly hasn't happened. In October 2021, Vera Baird, the victims SAR, said that violence against women and girls should be made a strategic policing requirement to give the issue direction, so that there is, and this is her exact words, no doubt what obligations the police have towards victims. And she also said there are many unanswered questions about how violence against women and girls is policed. And I think if we have this clear requirement, it sends a clear message that tackling it is a priority. Now, throughout this process, the Police and Crime Commissioner has maintained that it's sufficient to have it covered within his other priorities and doesn't need to be separated out, which is the opposite of what the victims SAR believes. So they can't both be right. And I would like to know from the Police and Crime Commissioner which of them is wrong, him or Vera Baird. Thank you.
And Councillor Barnett-Ward, Mr. Barber.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, councillors. I have great fun talking to Dame Vera Baird, and I greatly respect her views on many things. But I do maintain the position that I've had, that actually the issues that are covered by that generic term of violence against women and girls are clearly in my plan. And I've mentioned, again, the specific strategies that will be produced shortly on those 3 key areas around domestic abuse, safety for women in public spaces, and rape and sexual assault. And as I've explained at the Police and Crime Panel, my reason for not adopting them as one overarching thing is because actually I believe that the policing approach to them and indeed the way we deal with those issues for victims are very different from for those various different crime types. Indeed, the perpetrators are often different. So I think we need that nuanced approach. As you've heard, there are several areas of work going on within the force, which I've been supporting and will be looking to provide funding for in the budget to enable that work to go on operationally. But there is a significant difference between those people who are for example, victims of domestic abuse versus those who are victims of public place attack versus those who may be victims of sexual assaults. There can be a crossover. People may be victim of several, but as I've mentioned in my presentation, areas such as improving the criminal justice system to support victims of all of those crime types are important, as indeed I mentioned in the presentation around Project Vigilant and the importance of neighbourhood policing to prevent in the public space, and of course our need to improve investigations around domestic abuse. So as I've discussed before, I believe the area is adequately covered in here, and it is a significant issue within Thames Valley, and it's one that I think we are giving due priority to.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Councillor Barnett-Ward, your second question.
Thank you, Chair. As one of the Police and Crime Commissioner's first acts, he introduced a new formula that has been referred to as the fairer funding formula for community safety partnerships. I think those of us on this side of the chamber take some issue with that term. It halves Reading's community safety partnership funding and it doubles Wokingham's, despite the fact that our crime rate is double theirs. Now, this isn't universally condemned. The Police and Crime Commission, I'm sure, will be comforted to know that the Conservative members of this council supported his decision to divert money from Reading to elsewhere in the Thames Valley. But Labour councillors did not support that, and we know our residents do not support that. The Police and Crime Commissioner claims that the funding formula is needs-based, but the definition of need is fundamentally flawed. So I would like to know how the Police and Crime Commissioner can defend a policy that sees more money go to areas of higher affluence, areas of lower crime, and areas of lower antisocial behaviour. In a world of limited resources, which I do accept, why is he not targeting areas where the money can go furthest and making a positive difference? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Barnett-Ward. There are fewer and fewer Conservative councillors on this authority anyway, but Mr. Barber.
Thank you very much for your question, which I was anticipating. I can entirely understand those within Reading who clearly do not welcome this move, and any adjustment in funding downwards is going to be difficult, and that's why these changes have been phased in over 3 years, along with that guarantee of funding for the future. But I do maintain that this is a fair funding formula. It is based, as I've explained before, on population, on crime and non-crime data, which includes things such as antisocial behaviour, because that is one of the significant areas of work for community safety partnerships. And I'm very much open to anybody who can suggest an alternative formula. I don't recall Councillor Barnett-Ward suggesting an alternative at the Police and Crime Panel when this was discussed, and I haven't seen anybody come forward with a credible alternative thus far. If anybody is willing to, I'm very happy to consider that for the next iteration of this. But equally, I don't think it would be, I'm not sure how anybody in Reading can justify the fact under the previous formula, Reading received more money than Milton Keynes, despite having a population of more than 100,000 less, having crime figures almost half, and having a similar proportion around non-crime figures. And in actual fact, Reading received more than the whole of Buckinghamshire, which has a population of twice the size under the previous population, and crime figures around 4 times as much. So this is about introducing a fair funding formula. The funding previously was based on a carryover of allocations of various funding pots prior to the introduction of police and crime commissioners 10 years ago. So this is a funding formula which I will happily defend, and we will continue to work with the Community Safety Partnership because the support that my office give is not linked with the funding, and there is significant work that goes on with your Community Safety Manager, Joe Middlemass, to support the work of the CSP. We will work flexibly within the funding that we have. And indeed, of course, we've been successful in putting to the Home Office for the Safer Streets funding, which brings an additional £400,000 into Reading, which wouldn't have been delivered without the support of my office. So whilst I recognise that it may be unwelcome, I think it is a fair formula. I'll welcome any alternative funding formula that is reasonable, and we will continue to support Reading CSP to make sure that they get external funding from elsewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. I'm sure we can have a look at alternative formulas. I didn't realise it was on the table. Since the current one's only 3 bullet points, I'm pretty sure I can have a crack at something a bit more sophisticated. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair, and I echo what has already been said. Thank you very much for the presentations this evening. I just wanted to get some form of clarification, though, over what is regarded as cybercrime. I see that, you know, it is listed up there, but it's such a large area in my head. Most people think of cybercrime as being a way of phishing or getting information or selling information, etc. But when it really comes down to it, cybercrime is so much more in terms of the use of social media to influence, encourage people potentially to do criminal acts. We saw recently Matt Rodder speaking in the House of Commons, detailing that as part of the shocking events that took place with regard to the murder of Ollie Stevens, that you know, information had been shared on, I think, 6 social media platforms beforehand. So what I'd like to understand is what progress is being made in terms of ensuring correct monitoring of such platforms to help in the reduction of crime in that sort of way. So it's about not just looking at cybercrime as being financial crimes as such, but also human crimes in terms of not only sharing information on social media that could be detrimental, but also grooming and such like, which clearly takes place within this, within the new world of online. So just a few thoughts from the panel on that, please.
I think probably best directed firstly to the Chief Constable.
Yeah, very happy to take it. And you've hit on some of the challenges, Councillor, of what cybercrime is. You're absolutely right. There's cybercrime itself that you would associate with things like fraud. There's also, if you like, the nature of criminality that exists in the dark web, for example. There's also the type of things where crime is enabled through the world of cyber, and also, and I think touching on the on what happened in respect of Ollie Stevens, you've also got behaviours that perhaps in the past would have been verbal or text messages, now taking part on different platforms. The strategy from the police point of view, and I think I've touched on it with the digital investigation team, is to have a layered approach in terms of training and expertise around the different types of criminal investigation. And the first one is local officers having enough information and training to allow them to investigate the types of crimes that have now moved on. So bullying, for example, online harassment, that might have taken place in much more an open environment, and now is very much behind closed doors. So that's the training that they get. Then as we move through, if you like, the type of criminality that becomes using it as, if you like, a specific tool, then we're talking about putting our digital investigation team and our digital media investigators against that kind of criminal opposition, so to speak. I think around crime, that's cybercrime and fraud, we would assess that around about 80% of most fraud-enabled or cyber-enabled fraud is preventable. And that's the kind of the good housekeeping, passwords, the concern that you talked about phishing. I guess, so to your point, it's very wide-ranging. I think cybercrime is something that's a bit of a catch-all. We don't treat it as a catch-all. We have quite nuanced responses depending on the crime type itself. I think the great challenge for us all as policing is to make sure that our skills are match fit against the opposition, and we're keeping track of that. And we have specialist teams to do that, as well as some regional teams as well. I hope that helps, Councillor. In essence, you summed it up quite rightly at the start in terms of the complexity.
Did you have a second question, Councillor Robinson?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Councillor Hoskin.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And you'll be pleased to know I've only got one question, but it is something that is really close to my heart. It's actually following on from Councillor Barnett-Wall's question around the over 50% cut to the Community Safety Partnership funding. And I was listening to Mr. Barber's presentation. There was a lot of really good stuff in there, but stuff I was really surprised to hear, because he talked about reducing reoffending, he talked about preventative measures, and yet, which does make me wonder whether he actually understands where the funding is being spent on in Reading. So 55% of the budget that comes into Reading is spent on funding the criminal justice pathway into drug and alcohol treatment and the system. Now, this is very much absolutely funding that's about supporting reducing reoffending. And in fact, I'm sure I don't need to say this, Mr. Barber will know this, but 55% of, is it 55% of 45% of acquisitive crime is committed by people who are dependent on opioids and crack cocaine. And the evidence, which is very strong and was part of Dame Carol Black's independent review of drugs, shows that treatment reduces the level of offending and reoffending by considerable amounts. So to cut this funding is absolutely it's an absolutely incorrect decision, and is it will lead to really serious consequences, both in terms of offending in Reading, but also impacts upon the police service in Reading. So the kind of services that will have to change will be around moving towards a prescription-only element of service with no access to key working or group working, loss of attendance at prison release meetings and at court, and probation and partnership meetings. This is real impacts this is going to have. Now, Mr. Barber may also not realise that places like Reading, and in fact across the whole Thames Valley, have had also huge cuts to public health budgets from the government. So there is simply not the funding to replace this work, which will invariably lead to reductions in service. So I really would like to hear Mr. Barber to think that he might think again in terms of what is really a direct cut to the kind of work that was reduce offending, reoffending, and the partnership work, which is really important. And I think also around the funding formula, I would just simply say my belief in terms of funding such important work is to maintain it, and in fact a real terms maintenance of an inflationary increase to this funding, so that we don't fall behind. Because with COVID, with the kind of stress and the what we're seeing is actually increases in drug and alcohol dependencies and problems. And in fact, this is going to be a growing problem in Reading, and not one that's going to fall away and deserves this kind of cut. In terms of the funding formula, one of the things that Mr. Barber, I think, perhaps needs to sit back and think about is that Reading, you talk about population figures, Reading as an urban area is much, much greater than the local authority area. And in terms of things like drug and alcohol support and homelessness and crime, very much acts as a honeypot to the wider area, partly because we have services that are not provided by some of our neighbours. So, I mean, I think it's a wrong decision. I think it will have very worrying consequences in terms of the individuals that could be supported to be taken away from crime, from drug and alcohol addiction, and I think it will have actually a very quite serious consequences on the policing service itself. So I'd really ask that Mr. Barber might reconsider his cut to such important work. Thank you.
For clarity, what was? Okay, thank you.
My proposal is to maintain funding.
Okay, good. Mr. Barber.
Thank you very much. And of course, I hear all those arguments. Of course, I fund centrally a number of schemes, indeed, in Reading through Alana House, which works with vulnerable people, vulnerable women coming out of prison who often have been victims of crime themselves, often dealing with drug addictions. We provide funding for some of those services across Thames Valley, and our new work around reducing reoffending will of course engage with drug treatment in line with the government's wider drug strategy. So I wouldn't for a moment belittle that important work around substance misuse and the impact that has. But nevertheless, the CSP funding is not specifically for those areas of work. It is for the whole gamut of community safety, and that needs to be fairly distributed across the Thames Valley, and that's what I have sought to do. Councillor Page, you look like a one-question man. You're a one-question man?
I'll see. Chairman, can I endorse the comments you've made and thank the Chief Constable and the PCC and Steve Raffield for their contributions. We have a long-standing tradition of partnership working in Reading, but one of the areas where the partnership breaks down is the consistent refusal of the police to engage seriously with us in sharing powers around speed enforcement. This is an issue that John Campbell will know that I've raised with him and also with Matthew Barber on a number of occasions. And I would ask you to look seriously. Now, the climate nationally is changing substantially. We have all the London boroughs wanting to see a decriminalisation or partial decriminalisation around speeding enforcement. You've mentioned the experiment in Hampshire. I'd be grateful to hear more about that, not necessarily tonight, but you have a willing partner in Reading, and our efforts to engage around this with you are regularly rebuffed. And at a time when Thames Valley Police are retrenching and reducing resources in traffic policing, and as we sit here at this very moment, Panorama is broadcasting nationally a figure of a 15% cut in the last 2 or 3 years in roads policing resourcing, which I believe is what's reflected in Thames Valley. So my question firstly is about updating on resourcing. And bearing in mind that your priority for assisting us in enforcing 20 mph zones is very low, why it is that in the spirit of good partnership working, you resist a willing partner that wants to bring resources and a commitment to actually addressing serious speeding at a time when we haven't seen your mobile speed van in Reading for ages. And I realise that Matthew Barber's priority is rural areas and that the areas that didn't vote for him are being cut and basically sidelined. But I would say to the Chief Constable, who isn't a politician, that we are willing and wanting to talk to you seriously about reinforcing efforts to address serious speeding, which has worsened as a result of the pandemic, with different work patterns, less congestion, more speeding. And the other question relates to what I know you will say, and Matthew Barber will point to Community Speedwatch. Well, I'd like to know how you do Community Speedwatch around the IDR, the A33 Relief Road, which is where we suffer real problems of speeding and associated noise. You could park your mobile van over the IDR and make a fortune any day. You don't, you choose not to. We would like to get you to the table to talk seriously about this agenda and not be fobbed off as we have been in the past.
Thanks,
Two questions in one, very efficient. Shall I go to Mr. Barber first, and then I'll go to the Chief Constable?
Thanks.
Well, I think most of that was probably operational stuff for the Chief. I would obviously disagree with Councillor Page that you could find any political aspect in the decisions around funding or resources within either my office or Thames Valley Police. And if we simply refer to the Community Safety Fund, for example, which has been one of the areas of discussion this evening. One of those areas to gain most significantly has, of course, been Labour Milton Keynes, as has the coalition-run Oxfordshire, and there have been West Berkshire, Bracknell lost out slightly. So I don't think you can see a pattern in the politics, but Councillor Page will obviously choose to see those as he wishes. On the wider aspect around road safety, I completely agree. Looking at the figures for our roads policing, we certainly haven't seen that sort of drop as reported across Thames Valley in resources from roads policing across the country. But we do see the activity of our roads policing unit, both in policing our roads, but also the support they give to local officers within Reading to deal with other significant crime. As far as the decriminalisation is concerned, I think this is an area where there's certainly, from my perspective, there's no reluctance with this. We're simply not at a stage, as I understand it, where those legal powers exist to delegate those powers to local authorities, unlike the situation for parking example. I agree there probably is a growing appetite for that, and if the situation changes, I certainly don't have any in principle objections. I don't believe the Chief Constable has, but he can disagree with me, but I think we're simply in a position of working within the legal framework we have at this time.
Chief Constable.
Thanks, Michelle. Councillor Page, I absolutely don't underestimate your passion and desire for this, and certainly my passion and desire is for less road death and less serious injury. Did you obviously got my letter because you wrote to me formally about this. I didn't get a response from you to that letter. I don't know whether that's something I've missed, but I think that laid down exactly the force's position, was that we're absolutely not against such things like 20 mile per hour at all. But in terms of actually working with the council, there are some issues in terms of our ability to actually completely say that we're going to be able to enforce every 20 mile per hour limit is not just possible. We'll enforce it in exactly the same way we do every other enforcement activity, but our position will always be, and that of the Department of Transport, is the best way is to sort of like design the speed out of the roads rather than just have limits. On some occasions, for example, there is evidence to suggest that where a 20 mile per hour limit has been put in place, that has actually increased speed. There was an occasion where outside a school, self-policing with a small p actually meant that people were driving at a lot less than 20 miles per hour, and a 20-mile-per-hour limit actually increased the speed of which people were using that road. On the enforcement aspect of things, and in effect powers coming across the local authority, I think my letter shared that actually it's Department of Transport position regarding that ability for the local authority to be able to use those powers. It's not a police decision, it's a local authority decision. In terms of it's a Department of Transport, and I think I shared with you the comments from the lead advisor on this that suggested that or confirmed that. As far as mobile enforcement goes, whenever we put mobile cameras on, I will get an equal amount of people complaining about the mobile cameras generally, as will be supporting it. We have to put mobile cameras in the place where the evidence will support that they are there to prevent accidents and, if you like, injuries and loss of life. Thames Valley Police on a rolling average issue around 180,000 speeding enforcement tickets. So I don't think anybody can say that we're not committed to reducing road deaths through the enforcement of speeding. And in addition, your comments made about the reduction in roads policing aren't actually accurate. So we've not reduced those numbers over the last 2 or 3 years. They definitely have been reduced over the last 8 or 9 years as some of the challenges we faced through austerity. What I can say, because of the uplift of additional officers, one of the bids that I am looking at is an increase in roads policing resources, because I think we all recognise the important role that they do. Hopefully that helps.
Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the presentations. Green councillors share the concerns that Labour councillors have over cuts to police, cuts to budgets. But I wanted to ask about one of the statistics that was in Steve Radfield's presentation. Now, I was sat at the back, so it was hard to see the small font, but I think there was a 23% increase in violence with an injury in Reading in the concerns section of your presentation. I'd like a little bit more information about that offence and what action is being taken on the ground to bring that down.
Superintendent?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. The violence with injury covers a range of different crime classifications. I guess there are a couple of parts to this. One that's probably worth mentioning is we are, as a force, slightly better at recording some of our crimes now at the point of contact. So there will naturally be a slight increase in that. I think there is a positive to be gained from this as well, insofar as actually, if people are happier to tell us about, reported crime, then we've got a better ability to report it and get a good representation of the crime we've got. I suppose although we've seen this increase, and I alluded to this in my presentation, yes, there's been an increase in recorded crime, but actually the bit I think that I'd like to focus on, I guess, is our ability to detect crime in those classifications is actually better. So I understand your concerns, but I think my view on that would be that actually we're good at investigating some of this crime as well, and that's reflected in those figures.
Councillor White, did you have a follow-up?
No, only to say that it didn't really answer my question, but not to worry. Thank you for that, Councillor Grant.
I think that let's take it down in writing and send it over and get a full and proper response. Before I come to Councillor Robinson, I'll go around in the order of. So I had Councillor Rowland next.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank Commissioner Barber, Constable Campbell, and Superintendent Rathfield for their presentations this evening. Myself, I often tend to hit on those issues, not unlike my colleagues, that affect people right outside their front door. The issues of ASB and issues that affect their real day-to-day life, things that neighborhood policing really can make a difference about. One of the aspects that I'd like to talk about this evening kind of follows in line from Councillor Page's request about assistance with the speeding of vehicles. And I'd also like to address how one is dealing with motorbike nuisance, because that's something that kind of goes hand in hand with speeding vehicles. So we're talking about that motorbike nuisance, vehicles that have removed mufflers and choose to use our IDR and other roads through town as a speedway, and also an opportunity to grace us with loud noise all hours of the day and night. I've had meetings interrupted from home, and I face the back of a center court. I'm curious, when we can't be able to handle speeding as well as we can, how could we possibly handle such a situation as motorbike nuisance? It seems to go on with abandon, and yet we seem to be quite powerless as to how to deal with it. So I would welcome the opportunity as soon as we are able to bring, as Councillor Page said, a very eager LPA to be a partner to work not only with the issues of speeding, but also with such obnoxious ASB issues as motorbike noise nuisance that we truly cannot seem to get a handle on at this time. So how might you help us in this regard? Thank you.
I think there's one for the Chief Constable. Certainly Superintendent Raffield will be very familiar with it as an issue in any case. But if I go to the Chief Constable. You're muted.
Forgive me, Chair. Well, certainly an issue that we would want to, I say, assist or resolve. I guess one of the challenges, of course, if someone's on a motorbike and they have, if like, illegal exhausts in effect on their motorbike, then a patrolling officer, if they're aware of that, can and should stop that vehicle and enforce whatever regulations are in respect of their exhaust manifolds, etc., etc. Of course, they have to be physically present to do that, unless, councillor, there's any particular patterns to what you're suggesting, because in some parts of the force we obviously have events where motorists come together, or events where they meet up on a Friday, Saturday night on some open spaces, and we've done some enforcement activity against that kind of behaviour. Certainly, if there's any particular patterns that would help us, I've got a sense that might not be the case, but if I can hand over to Steve, because there's definitely something that Steve can take away outside of the meeting and see what can be done. Steve.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I mean, I think this goes to the issue, which is, you know, antisocial behaviour ultimately. I mean, and actually, I'd welcome any work we can do around, you know, kind of identifying those areas where this is a particular problem, and then making sure that we feed back to the local authority and, in fact, the community what we've done. I mean, having sat over a lot of my daily management meetings where we talk about antisocial behaviour, knife crime, etc. I mean, this kind of issue does occasionally come up, and there are occasions where we've stopped mopeds that have turned out to be stolen. There are knife carriers involved. So there are some good examples of some really good police work. I think perhaps what we're not doing always is publicising some of our good results when we do have them. But I think definitely there's a piece of work to do to understand where those areas where perhaps that harm is being caused that I can take away and look at.
And Chair, if I might do, and I think it's just to the councillor's point, can I just go? I know Councillor Page and I have corresponded on the issues of speed enforcement, as I mentioned, and I just want to clarify that Thames Valley Police are very keen to engage with Reading Borough Council on how we can make, if you like, the communities of, if you like, Reading less subject to antisocial behaviour that's associated with speed enforcement, and also speed enforcement itself. There are on occasion we might take a different professional view on how the best way to resolve that, but I wouldn't want anybody to think that we're not committed to this. And if there's more we can be done and get around the table, very happy to do that. It just might be the methodology that we have sometimes professional, or if you like, guidance from others that suggest we can't do exactly what might be offered.
If I can just add to that as well, Chairman, I mentioned road safety was one of those areas I'm looking to develop a strategy for, which goes obviously beyond policing and working with partners. And I've had several conversations in different parts of the force area about very similar problems to this. There aren't any easy answers. One thing that I am interested in looking at, which Surrey have been trialling, is around noise cameras, which don't focus on speed, but as the name suggests, look at the noise, particularly of motorbikes. Now, there are some real challenges with enforcing through this. When I first heard about those, I was quite excited about the prospect, but there are some real issues around actually being able to enforce as a result of using that technology. But they are the sorts of things that we need to be looking at. So, as I say, Surrey are trialling those, I believe, at the moment, and very keen to look at the outcomes of those and if they're able to actually progress any cases to court as a result. And if they are, then we'll certainly look at employing that technology.
Okay, noise camera. Councillor Rowland, you had a second short question, I hope.
Well, I'd just like to come back for a little bit of clarity on this, because what I seem to feel and what I get a sense of is that this could be a very, very difficult area to resource. We've spent a lot of time, and I know that obviously as a police force, you all are more and more focused, and very rightly so, on serious crimes, knife crimes and issues like this, but still within the aspect of neighborhood policing, within this aspect of motorbike nuisance, which would involve your ability to have better traffic enforcement. I feel like we're coming up shortchanged on resourcing, and maybe even just a quick answer as to, do you all see that as something that you can resource, or is that going to be something that you're going to continue to struggle with?
So,
Chief Constable?
Can I just come in on this one, Chairman? The Chief Constable has something.
Why not?
I don't think this is purely about resources. Resources are clearly finite, and we will need to prioritise where they are. But I think the challenge around this particular issue is as much one of tactics and what is the approach that is going to work to deal with it. As much as resources. We could put all of our roads policing resources into Reading to try and stop antisocial motorcycle riders, aside from the fact that it would leave the rest of Thames Valley's roads unpoliced. But I'm not sure that would necessarily solve the problem overnight, because actually it's about which offences are we looking for people for? Is it around noise? Is it about antisocial driving? How are we actually going to apprehend those individuals? What's the evidence we've got to produce those, certainly if it's around noise, etc. So that's not to suggest that this is a problem that can't be solved, but just to point that it's not, I don't think, just simply one of resources. It's a case of finding the best approach, which is why, as I said, I'm very interested in technology around this. It's not a panacea, but I think we need to be looking at the approach we take rather than just the amount of resource we throw at it.
I often think you might find that some investment in the way you communicate the action you are taking around certain things might bear some dividends as well. I think TVP and probably a great many police forces are not particularly good at talking about the things that they are doing, and often residents do come away with the impression that the police are doing nothing, when in fact, we know that there is some work going on, but it's not well communicated. I think that would both provide community reassurance, which is important, but also give the public a sense of how they might be able to help best in the effort around combating things like ASB and low-level crime and disorder. And I think there is a big piece of work to be done in that regard. Councillor O'Connell.
My question follows on almost perfectly from what you've just said, Councillor Brock. I couldn't help but pick up on the increased use of stop and search powers as an attempt to reduce knife crime. And I think all of us, particularly here in Reading, where knife crime has been such a difficult issue on quite a personal level for the town, we recognise the need for stop and search, but there's also very much been some bad publicity around the way that the way that the police target stop and search. I was going to ask about that, but then you mentioned that there would be public access, I believe, to footage from body-worn cameras so that members of the public can see stop and search conduct. Now, I didn't know that that was available. This is what you were talking about, Councillor Brock, about perhaps communicating things to reassure groups within the community that behaviour is being monitored and fairness is being applied to all groups and all demographics across society. So I suppose my question's quite a practical one, because I hadn't heard of this until this evening. A body camera is standard. Who can request to see the footage? How long is the footage kept for? Has this policy been in place for long? And are suspects told about this policy as they're being searched or during the search process? Because I'm a teacher and I work with young males, some from ethnic minority groups, who are disproportionately likely to be stopped and searched. And I feel it's very important for them to know their rights in all circumstances, not just with the police, but in all life circumstances. They should know their rights.
Sorry, Matthew, did you want to come in?
Well, I'll kick off, John, and you can follow on with more detail, I'm sure. I think stop and search, as you said, is a really useful tool. And we've seen some awful incidents in Reading over the last couple of years, and frankly, controversial though the power can be, don't we all wish that those individuals responsible have been stopped and searched on their way to those horrific incidents? But you're quite right to raise the understandable concern there is in various parts of the community around the use of the power. Some of that, inevitably, it goes back to the point that Councillor Brock was making about communication. Some of that is from things that happen outside of Thames Valley Police, that policing corporately will share the blame for. But so you're right, we need to communicate that. There is already a significant level of oversight into stop and search. We have a specific stop and search panel. I have actually it reports jointly to the Chief Constable myself. We have a professional standards and ethics panel that can look at these issues as well, along with use of force, etc., and all these other various points of oversight we have. The new piece of work is looking at how we can open that up. Now, that's not, it would be overstating it to say that a member of the public can simply request some body-worn video, but the challenge we've got at the moment is that scrutiny that we have of body-worn video at the moment from stop and search is very much from people within the policing family, if you like, our independent advisory groups, our stop and search panels, and they are independent, but we need to be able to explain and demonstrate to the wider public that there is some genuine scrutiny outside, and these aren't just our friends, if you like, within policing. And so the endeavour is to try and get more people from outside to be able to see this. Now, that's a big project. It's not available yet, and it's not ever going to be I just want to watch some body-worn video. But it's about finding individuals who perhaps have some lived experience, perhaps people who've been stopped by the police before, perhaps not the usual suspects of people who will join independent panels, and finding a way of being able to share that with them without having to go through the vetting process, which some of our panel members normally do. So we're looking at how we can redact some of that body-worn video automatically to make that available to a wider audience, but not the public as such. Because I think it's really important, as you say, that we do seek to reassure people about the use of that power in order to be able to justify the continued use of that power, which is incredibly helpful. I don't know if John or Steve, you want to add more?
Well, just to endorse all of that, we in the police, we recognise the nature and some of the negative impact that even if it's done well and lawfully, the actual engagement with the police, being stopped and searched, is kind of like a difficult experience to go through. No one's ever going to say that that's going to be an enjoyable process. Our training is around making sure they're operating within the law, that we recognise it's a power, and that has a significant impact on the individual, and that we treat people with dignity and respect. And certainly, almost as a minimum, people can go away from that interaction with the police to understand why it took place, and feel that whilst they might not personally have enjoyed it, they understand why we did it. As part of that are those checks and balances that we've talked about. We get very few complaints in Thames Valley Police about our stop and search, but there can be reasons for that. You know, not everybody that's subject to stop and search, the profile of largely often young men, are going to be the first on the phone to pick up to our professional standards. So there's no complacency around that. But those checks and balances that the Commissioner talked about, that independent scrutiny. So that independent advisory group that basically monitors our stop and search can at random view any of our stop and search that have taken place. They just get access to our library. And to the councillor's point, yes, they are recorded. The instruction is for stop and search. There is a recording that takes place. There's a very bright red light that goes on the body-worn video, which is issued to all officers as well. I'll leave Steve to talk a little bit about the local thing, which is the scrutiny panel. So that is in effect enhancing the rigour that we want to do. On the back of the George Floyd protests that we had after that terrible murder, we wanted to galvanise, if you like, the appetite for people to challenge policing and use some of those, if you like, voices that were raising concerns in a positive way. And a number of people around the force are now part of those scrutiny panels that can hold us to account. But if Steve, are you able to, I don't know how up to date you are with the ones in Reading, are you able to share any more detail about the Reading scrutiny panel?
Yeah, so thank you, sir. So we are, and I think what the council is alluding to is that comment I made about scrutiny panels. I mean, we are putting together a panel of people to look specifically at stop and search and how we conduct it, slightly separate to the local IAG, a slightly different attendance. We're working through that at the moment, but what we're hoping to do is get some views from people to use that to feed back to our staff to deal with some of these issues that we're talking about that can sometimes impact nationally and on the force. The only other thing I'd say in addition to what's been said is I completely agree, stop and search is a fantastic tool. I think for me, it's about that targeted approach to stop and search. I mean, we certainly don't just randomly go out and stop search people, but we do, you know, you're aware of some of the incidents we've had in particular areas of Reading. And for me as a commander, having that ability to put the Section 60 powers on a particular geographic area to give our communities a bit of reassurance and to be able to stop further incidents of violence is very useful. But the way we go about that and the way we communicate with our communities is also vital as well.
Yeah, Councillor Ennis, I know you had a question on a related topic, so it probably makes sense for me to bring you in now.
I did. I think there's been some discussion about it. You know, nationally, we know about disproportionality. Stop and search affects the black community more markedly than any other community, and we want to know what the local picture looks like. But it's really a reassurance for a very large proportion of our community in Reading, who many have identified to us on many occasions that their concern of the disproportionality use of stop and search. So, you know, what is the local update on the figures, if you can give us an update, and how can you reassure the black community in Reading that their views about being used disproportionality is not the case? Thank you.
I haven't actually got the figures for Reading to hand. We can get them to you. There is, I mean, in terms of policing figures, it does vary from location to location across the forest area. There can be and there is some disproportionality in certain areas. We have to work hard at understanding that disproportionality because it's not always as simple as it seems. And by that I mean, on occasion, for example, if depending on what the nature of the profile of the community is, if that's largely a white community, for example, under a particular kind of criminal activity, it happens to be a community of a different background that might be not a community, but certain offenders from a different particular background. So, for example, a county drug line, on occasion, that can mean if we're stopping that county drug line and they happen to be from a certain ethnic background, that can have an impact on the disproportionality figures. Now, those stop checks in their own right are absolutely right. However, there is no doubt that we have to look very carefully at the reasons behind any disproportionality. And there's an expression that's come out of a variety of if you like, reviews of such things of disproportionality in lots of areas of, if you like, public service. and that's about explain or reform. You know, either explain the disproportionality and give confidence to the community, and if you like, to other agencies that, you know, whatever is being done, there's a reason behind that disproportionately, or change your working practices. And certainly that's very much what, you know, our considered approach is in Thames Valley Police, and those scrutiny processes that we've talked about, I hope will only enhance that. I mean, in terms of the numbers that we do, the numbers that we do are actually, I'd say, relatively modest in terms of the amount of people that live within the Thames Valley, but they will be focused on certain generally higher crime areas, and that can have, again, a disproportionate effect. But we can certainly get those figures. One of my chief officers for local policing, he reviews those figures at a legitimacy board that looks at all the different types of interactions that we have within the community, and how that might impact on people's confidence in what we do. And that's something that then reports into me, and also that public body, that strategic stop and search IAG as well.
Thank you. Councillor Robinson, you seemed keen to use your pocketed second question.
Yes, if I may. Earlier on, we were looking at the reductions in crime, which have been great over the last few years. I did have a question in mind, which was, what was the impact of lockdown on those figures? But certainly Commander Raffield answered that for me in terms of saying that it was over the last 5 years. However, when Councillor White asked his question, which was relating to the crime concerns in Reading, based on the increase in violent incidents, a question I have is, within those figures, were domestic violence incidents included? And the reason I ask this is because obviously during lockdown, there was an awful lot of stress placed on families and communities in terms of all being stuck in the same household, etc., which could have severely impacted on the domestic violence incidents reported. So just wanted to understand whether analysis had been done on these figures and what impact lockdown actually had on those figures itself.
Thank you. If I can help, in the very first lockdown, if we can all take ourselves back to 2020, we were very concerned that we saw a big drop off in reporting of domestic abuse. What we concluded was, and we were actually proactively contacting victims of domestic abuse. We assessed those that had been previously medium and high risk, and actually got in touch with them proactively during that time, just to make sure that they were safe and well and were able to access us and weren't, if you like, being prevented from doing that. No was the general answer. Things were okay generally. And what we saw is, in terms of our overall numbers, in that first wave, it was probably the reduction in domestic abuse was probably because perpetrated violence that was committed by people who were estranged from their partners. That's what couldn't take place, because of the lockdown. A violent offender that lived away from their partner couldn't visit. So that was that original reduction in that first wave. However, since then, we have seen an increase in domestic abuse. So the figures that Steve referred to are violence with injury. That is not including domestic violence. We separate those out. We have separate processes and separate teams that look at domestic abuse as well. It remains a concern, Councillor, because even with an increase, we still think it's terribly underreported. So it's one of those crime types that it sounds kind of counterintuitive. We don't have reduction targets for domestic abuse in the same way that we don't have reduction targets for certain types of sexual crime, because we fear it's underreported. And actually, we want to encourage people. It'll be very easy to have strategies to if you like, reduce domestic abuse by not taking it seriously in any way. So we don't welcome an increase. That'd be wrong. But numbers have increased around domestic abuse. Our response and our outcomes on detection certainly increased last year. That was very welcome. But we do need to watch this area very, very closely, because I think you're right. I think there's a hidden tail to some of the stresses and strains that people have been through, and some of the way that manifests itself. And it's not a justification, but it's a factor, is that within family and domestic environments that, people do sometimes have recourse to violence. And I think it's something collectively as a partnership we need to be alive to.
Councillor Terry.
Thank you, Chair. I don't mind who answers this
this question. Previously, you've confirmed a commitment to neighbourhood policing, and I think it was in the presentation. It does seem rather a long time ago now. Nonetheless, there does appear to have been depleted numbers active in neighbourhoods. I wonder if you could explain why this is.
I can take it, if I take it generally, and then Steve might be able to come in locally. We certainly saw a reduction across the whole area in terms of our PCSO numbers, and that's at one stage. It will be the same sometimes for yourselves in local government, that sometimes, if you like, the budget settlements come out a little bit later than we all might want for planning purposes. And certainly up until around 18 months ago, we were anticipating a reduction in our PCSOs. So that meant that some of our establishment numbers reduced. Now, very pleased to say, with the combination of government grant, but also from the preset that took the increase in preset last year, we were able to commit to maintaining and increasing our recruitment in around the gaps in PCSOs. So PCSOs are here to stay. I get an awful lot of support and feedback around our PCSOs. They're a team of people that work very well with partnerships. They tend to stick around longer sometimes than they are the regular face of community teams as well. We're also dedicated to maintaining our neighbourhood teams. We get concerned sometimes about the abstractions away from neighbourhoods, but I want our neighbourhood teams, I'm sure Steve does, I'll hand over him shortly for the local view, want familiar, accessible and regular contact from communities. You know, the response teams do a marvellous job of coming to people in need, of patrolling and preventing crime, but that regular relationship with the police, neighbourhood policing is at the heart. And obviously they're often, if you like, that regular contact between my teams in policing and your teams as part of community safety and any of the kind of like warden provision that you may have. But Steve, any comments on neighbourhood policing locally?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely echo those points. I'm committed to neighbourhood policing. I think there's a strong element of problem solving that goes into neighbourhood policing, both with the neighbourhood policing team themselves and our dedicated problem solving teams. I think locally, perhaps in recent times where we've struggled is some of the serious incidents we've had in Reading. We tend to lean into some of our neighbourhood teams and our PCSOs to support some of those functions around scene watches and bits and pieces. And also, you know, occasionally when we've been through some stresses of strains of COVID and some of the resourcing issues we've had there, we on occasions do lean into our neighbourhood teams to support emergency policing. Again, that for me is not something I particularly want. We'd all, you know, agree that we want neighbourhood teams that are well resourced and well tasked, but that's been the reality over recent months, I'm afraid.
Councillor Terry, you had a second question.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, the question is for you. I was wondering if you were responsible for the Metropolitan Police, do you think you would be investigating Partygate now?
Councillor, it probably won't surprise you that I would leave that to the Metropolitan Police to have a view on. Obviously, I've got a responsibility for Thames Valley, and I guess the Met are working closely with all the agencies looking into the matters. But I'll probably leave it there, Councillor, but understand the question.
I wonder if there are any parties at Chequers. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, none that have been reported thus far.
Very good. Well, I hope for your enjoyment that one gets reported at some point. I think that's a great place to leave it. So thank you to the three of you for coming along this evening. Really appreciate it. I'm sure we'll have some follow-ups that we'll send over in written form as well. But yes, I hope you'll have a good evening, and I'm sure we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for the support you give my officers and Steve and the team at Reading. It's very much appreciated and very precious. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Let's get on to the stuff that the public gallery's packed out to hear about. On to item 7, the adoption of the design guide for shopfront supplementary planning document. Mark Warringham, I'm guessing, is awake somewhere on the magic box.
I am awake. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you.
So this relates to the design guide to shopfront supplementary planning document, which provides detailed planning guidance to assist developers in improving the quality of the shopfronts within their development proposals. This is something we don't have any detailed design guidance on at the moment, and the last time we did so was part of the 1998 local plan. So this therefore fills a gap that we've got in detailed policy. It also sits well with the ongoing High Streets Heritage Action Zone programme within our town centre conservation areas, part of which involves actions to improve shop fronts in those areas. A supplementary planning document, or an SPD, is a document which provides more detailed planning guidance to complement policies in the local plan. This document therefore links to policies within our 2019 local plan. A draft of this SPD was agreed for consultation by Policy Committee in July, and there was subsequently a consultation period which ended in September. The results of that consultation are summarised within the report, but although there were comments around the general points, the document was in general welcomed. So after consideration of the comments, an amended version of the SPD has been produced, and the proposal is that committee formally adopts this as planning policy. Once adopted, the document will be used to guide decisions on relevant planning applications related to shop fronts. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warringham. Councillor Page.
Little to add, Chair. Can I thank Mark Warringham for the enormous amount of work that's gone into this. It is a readable, above all, a very colourful document that I would commend to colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Page. Councillor Rowland.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to thank officers for their work on this. With my involvement with the High Street Heritage Action Zone, this has been something that I've been watching quite closely. I think it's really good for Reading as we protect our high streets and protect our retailers for the future. And this provides some really good guidance so that retailers can indeed ensure that they are attractive destinations and exciting destinations for the future. And this is really important for us. I just also wanted to thank officers too for their attention and working with those in the disabled community, those that need to ensure that our shop fronts are accessible for all. And this sets out guidelines wherein that accessibility is important and how that relationship can work and needs to work for our shop fronts, because we are building an inclusive economy, and that is something that is very important that that we build. The shop front guide works well within that, and I welcome the and thank officers for the extra effort in that situation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Rowland. Very important indeed, and obviously good that it's integrated here in the sort of policy stage rather than something to be dealt with in implementation alone. Councillor Robinson, you look like a man who appreciates a good shop front.
I certainly do, sir. Yes. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just I'll keep it short and sweet. Just to echo the thanks to the officers for all their hard work and effort in bringing this guide to us. Those of us that have been on planning have certainly seen this in the past, and we certainly welcome, and on behalf of our group, we will be backing the recommended action. We welcome this design guide as a welcome addition to the local plan and for use in our planning process. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So no other indications, so not detecting any dissent. So is it okay if we move the recommended actions as printed and agree those? Yes, wonderful, unanimous. Thank you very much. But don't go away, Mr. Warringham, because you have to tell us about the main modifications to the Central and Eastern Berkshire Joint Minerals and Waste Local Plan.
I do have that pleasure, yeah. So the this report relates to the, as you say, the Joint Central and Eastern Berkshire Minerals and Waste Plan that's being prepared by the council together with its neighbours Wokingham, Bracknell Forest and Windsor and Maidenhead. The plan sets out planning policies related to minerals extraction and waste management facilities across the 4 authorities, and it'll have the same status as the council's local plan adopted in 2019. It'll replace existing minerals and waste plans for the area, which are now more than 20 years old and in serious need of replacement. Now, we've reported progress of this plan to this committee on a number of occasions now, and the documents reached an advanced stage of production. It was submitted to the Secretary of State in March last year, and this opened up a public examination stage, where the plan's considered by planning inspectors. The 2 inspectors appointed need to judge whether the plan's sound and legally compliant, and it can only be adopted as policy if those tests are passed. We've now had the public hearings back in September and October, and the 2 appointed inspectors have identified a number of areas where they'd like to see some changes to ensure that the plan can be judged to be sound and legally compliant, and these are known as main modifications, and the regulations require that we undertake consultation on them before the inspectors can make a recommendation that they be incorporated. That's now quite a common feature of the examination stage, and our own local plan had to go through this as well. So this report therefore proposes that the main modifications that are in Appendix 2 be published for consultation, and responses to that consultation will then be passed directly to the inspectors, who will take them into account in preparing their final report. All being well with that report, that will mean that the plan can be adopted and will become part of the planning policy framework for the borough. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warringham. Councillor Page.
Nothing to add to that, Chair. I would move formally the adoption of the recommended action.
Anybody else? Councillor Skeens? No? I thought you were really fine. Well, no other indications, so not detecting dissent. I'm going to assume, therefore, are we okay to agree the recommended action? Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Warringham. That takes us on to item 9, the Social Value Policy Annual Update Report. Kate Grafer, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So just to briefly introduce this report, as has been stated both on the agenda and at the start of the report, this is the first annual update on social value policy implementation since we endorsed our social value policy in December 2020. So the aim of the report really is to give a summary of the social value policy implementation, namely, especially looking at how much social value we have sought to obtain through procurement and contracts, which is the main aim of the policy itself. I think it would be fair to say that whilst this is something that we've been able to make a start on during the course of this year, it is something which we are looking to expand on even further from learnings and information through to officers on an ongoing basis throughout the rest of the year. So we have a very positive start, albeit smaller in value than we might initially want, to 14% of our contracts, which include a form of social value. Just to be clear on what we mean by social value is something that we consider to be delivery of benefits over and above the contracted requirements with a contractor. Now, that is predominantly looking at, when we say social value, things such as opportunities around local employment and skills, for example, but it can also include environment and climate, which might be as much around training or apprenticeships in that particular area. And I think that the piece which we've certainly found as a team that we've needed to pick up through the year as we've gone through really is that clarification that this is outside what is required from a contract. Clearly, as a council, we do already engage in a number of contracts which by their very nature are around improvement of social and environmental factors around the authority area. Really, the main focus for the policy going forward, and with continued training and rollout for us, is to look at aiming at deployment of social value and obtaining social value around target areas from the authority, especially looking at addressing any inequalities that we have. So there is close work going on with the Social Inequalities Group, chaired by Zelda Wolfley as one of my assistant director colleagues, therefore continuing to look to target areas such as digital inclusion, jobs and skills, and equally wanting to make sure that we continue to address the climate emergency. That said, as I said, the report does also show the positive start that we've been able to make, including broadband connections to community properties and Faster Future programme places, which is career training from those from a disadvantaged background, just as examples by way of that we have achieved. Just also to briefly note that within the legal section of the report, I've highlighted the fact that there have been some changes to procurement guidance, not yet statutory requirements, but showing that our policy is ahead of guidance that was issued from a national perspective on consideration that we should have for procurement and contracts around social value. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Director. Councillor McEwen.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to thank officers for this report, which measures social value. It provides, as mentioned, it provides the first annual update and seeks to capture specific social value which will benefit our residents. The report highlights that social value is increasing across the borough and work is ongoing to ensure that social value principle is embedded in all of our procurement, regardless if it is a large or small contract. It's a new focus for the council, and it's important that the good work outlined in the report continues. The appendix to the report highlights some of the ongoing work. Specifically, Virgin Media has agreed to support up to 6 community properties by providing free broadband for 5 years. And also Agilicis will fund 10 fast future places for young people in Reading. The purpose of this particular programme is to enhance participant employmentability and providing them participants with key work skills. And I think they're both examples of a successful social value policy which will ultimately benefit the people of Reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McEwen. I think it's a wonderful and important thing that we try to extract as much social value from our contracts as we can, and good to see some of the companies kind of committing to apprenticeships and training opportunities and so on, and local supply chains, and clearly a lot of work to do, but what has been achieved just in a year I think is very impressive, and it's good to see the projection forward around that as well. So nobody else has indicated, so if I move the recommended action, are we okay to agree that? Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Assistant Director. Moving us on then to item 10, the approval of local council tax reduction scheme for 22 to 23. Have I got Sam Wills? There she is. Over to you, Sam.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. So the report before you sets out a range of recommendations of amendments to our local council tax reduction scheme for the upcoming financial year. There are 5 recommended changes which either provide an increased level of support or reduce administrative processes for customers and staff. There's a requirement each year for local authority to review the scheme, and if amendments are proposed, a consultation process has to be undertaken and responses duly considered. As it stands, current support levels increase the overall council tax collectible, but the revenue generated can place customers in hardship and increase resource required to recover the debt. So there are 5 recommended changes for the financial year 22-23. The first change to be considered is the increase in percentage of level of support. So the consultation in respect of this change gave 2 options. So for 22-23, persons of working age would be required to make a minimum contribution between 25 and 30% towards their council tax liability. Essentially, the maximum reduction available to a person of working age would be between 70 and 75% of their council tax liability. So this option provided an increase in support from the current 65% maximum. The range indicated allowed for consideration of caseload changes between when we undertook the data modelling in August 21 and the tax base setting coming through in January 22. As the caseload has remained stable from the original data modelling, the introduction of a 25% minimum contribution would exceed affordability within the medium-term financial strategy, and therefore it's recommended that the minimum contribution is reduced from 35% to 30%. The second change proposed is to remove the current minimum support level of £5 per month. This will reduce the number of council tax support claims that ends, thus reducing the number of reapplications, and ensures customers receive the support they are entitled to no matter how small. The third change recommended is that the upper capital limit is increased from 3,000 to 6,000, essentially, which means people with less than 6,000 would now qualify for a reduction. with a supplementary recommendation that the restriction on submitting a new claim during the remainder of the billing year where the capital is subsequently spent is removed, taking into account there are existing processes within the policy that ensures claimants that purposely deprive themselves of capital for eligibility purposes are administered appropriately. The fourth change recommends a maximum 1 month backdating provision is included within the scheme. A working age claimant must have good reason for their late claim throughout the period of backdating, but that change would align with the current housing benefit and universal credit regulations. And the fifth change recommended is a standard rate of £10 non-dependent deduction is introduced to apply regardless of whether the non-dependent is engaged in remunerative work. So there are certain categories that attract no deduction, and these remain in place for both working age and pension age customers. But the proposed change would provide an increased level of support for those currently with a higher deduction. In addition to the greater level of support, the change would provide a reduction in administration, with currently just over 300 live claims in receipt of a non-dependent deduction, for each claim requiring proof of that income, either 5 weekly pay slips, 2 monthly, 3 fortnightly, details of other income. The administration overhead would be removed entirely with the proposed change. So following agreement from Policy Committee in September, the statutory public consultation ran from the 27th of November through to the 21st of November, with just approximately 97,000 emails issued to residents to encourage them to take part in that consultation. We received just over 1,200 responses, with over 70% in favour of the proposals, with some of the proposals reaching over 80%. And Appendix 2 to this report sets out a summary of those responses. Of the 1,200 responses received, just over 96 were from residents, with the remainder from other local businesses, the voluntary sector, local charities, landlords or other. And just under 12% of the total respondents were in receipt of council tax support. The 4 tables at paragraph 10.1 of the report demonstrates the estimated expenditure based on the current caseloads. The tables demonstrate the varying additional funding requirements depending on whether we were looking for a 25% or 30% minimum payment, and whether a 1.99% or 2.99% increase in council tax is to be approved. The tables at 10.2 demonstrate the cost to the authority, so these range from 424,000 to 736,000, depending on the varying rates of support and overall tax increase. The proposed changes provide greater levels of support to ensure we continue to protect the most vulnerable and would apply from the 1st of April 22. The decision about the scheme is linked to the decision that is reserved to council to set the council tax base for the council tax setting purposes. So effectively increasing council tax support reduces the tax base, so less money is collected for each pound at council tax set. So we propose that the scheme changes as detailed are agreed and recommended forward to full council, and based on affordability within the medium term financial strategy, we recommend that the 30% minimum contribution option is taken forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, this was unanimously supported when we went out to consult on it, so I'm assuming nobody has an issue with it now. I think it's a really positive thing. Clearly, in a world of increased costs and a rising cost of living and inflation, it's important that we do all that we can to help those who are on the lowest incomes here in Reading. And certainly it's something, a change, a positive change that I've wanted to achieve for quite some time. So I'm very pleased to have it here tonight. And of course, we'll ensure that it's fully funded and properly funded through the budget as we move forward. Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Green councillors are happy to vote for the measures in the report, which we supported before. We want to see people on low incomes paying less council tax. We hope that in future the council will be able to go further. Green councillors support tackling poverty. We want to see a more equal town, and we support these measures to help people on low incomes paying their council tax.
Any other indication? No. Okay, well, I'll assume that everybody's okay with the recommended action. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Now that takes us, and thank you, Sam. That takes us to the end, I think, of the public portion of the meeting. And I need to move the customary motion as printed in item 11 of the agenda sheet to exclude the press and public. Are we all agreed to that? Agreed. Wonderful. Thank you very much. And good night, everybody.